Yeah, actually, that's kind of the first thing that I noticed this morning when I came in the sanctuary.
Free money on the pulpit?
Usually our props are on the table area, and so as I was looking at this, I noticed that, hey, this is real loot. And so I thought, Sarah Lynn, is this a bribe
We counted that.
for me to have a shorter sermon? If so, I will not accept bribes in public.
We counted it.
So our text for this morning comes from the Gospel of Matthew, and I confess that I love the book of Matthew. Now you hear me say that almost about every book of the Scripture, well, except for maybe Numbers and Revelation. But Matthew is one of my favorite books in the New Testament, and I find it to be especially instructive for a Lenten series titled The Song of Shadows. I find it a practical, easily read and understood manual for getting through the darkness and the shadows we find. Now, I say that because the writer of the gospel knew about shadows and lived through dark times, and our text for this morning speaks of a particularly devastating darkness, the darkness of betrayal. The season of Lent is meant for movement into and through the shadows of self-reflection and confession and coming to grips with things like personal sacrifice, like learning to forgive. The likes of which Jesus offers us through his example. So in today's text, we focus upon Jesus foretelling that he will be betrayed. See, he already knows it's coming, and he knows who's going to do it. But Matthew doesn't bother to get into the why of it. Other gospels speculate it's all about the money. Jesus was sold out by Judas simply to make a buck. Now, I struggle with that conclusion because Jesus, in a lonely place where the crowds weren't surrounding him and they wouldn't see him arrested, was worth a whole lot more than 30 pieces of silver to the priests and to Rome. Now, some modern theologians theorize that Judas was actually an ancient terrorist who wanted war with Rome. And when Jesus refused to recruit an army, Judas tried to force him into war by turning him over to the priests, who in turn turned him over to Rome for execution. Thinking, well, if he really is the Messiah, come to save Israel, surely he'd defend himself and Israel. But friends, does it really make any difference in the telling of why Judas betrayed Jesus? According to Scripture, he did it. And what about the other disciples who pledged to fight for Jesus with their very lives? And yet, when the rubber hit the road, they hit the road and hid. Was that not betrayal? And Peter, who denied ever even knowing Jesus, surely that was betrayal as well. And as Alyssa said just a moment ago, some of us likely know about betrayal as well. Maybe we've been a victim ourselves and it ripped our hearts out. But maybe we betrayed someone else, and perhaps through our actions or inactions, like Judas, we have betrayed Jesus. Maybe we have. How do you get through a darkness like that? Well, before we get into that, let's pause to center our hearts in prayer. Gracious and loving God, the journey that is Lent is a dark one. where we have to walk through not only the shadows of the road that Jesus walked, but we have to walk through our own shadows as we reflect on our faith and our lives and who we are and who we want to be. So this morning, we know that you have a word for us. Something to help us see, something to help us understand and get through this darkness that maybe even is in our lives, in our hearts. So we know that if we're going to get everything out of the message this morning, we need to be open to it. So I pray that you send us a spirit of openness and open our hearts and our minds and our ears for the message that you have for us. And I pray that I can find a way to get out of the way so that it's not my words, but it's your words, your people here this morning. Amen. So as we continue the journey of Lent this morning, we need to accept that we share at least one thing with Judas. The human default setting to serve ourselves first, to betray God and each other in order to fulfill our own plans. This brings us, or maybe just me, to the heart of our discussion for today. To the human shadows and dark places we often find in our lives and in our souls and are reluctant to engage them. How do we get through these scary, dehumanizing places? Because most of us, well, we don't like scary, do we? Barbara Brown Taylor, one of my favorite Christian authors and preachers, by the way, discusses this in a book she wrote in 2014 titled Learning to Walk in the Dark. In the introduction, she pointed out from the earliest times, Christians have used darkness as a synonym for sin and ignorance, spiritual blindness, and death. Yet at the theological level, this darkness language creates all sorts of problems. It divides the day in two, pitting the goodness of the light against the fearful things that lurk in the dark. This comparison tucks all of the sinister stuff into the darkness, identifying God only with the sunny part and leaving us to deal with the rest on our own time. So, she said about exploring the dark. The dark she found in the total darkness of a cave with experienced cavers. And she experienced the chapel of Our Lady of the Underground far below the sanctuary floor of Notre Dame in Paris. But she also looked deep within herself into the dark places she found there. And in the closing pages of her book, she offers this: whether you decide to explore the dark alone or with company, your job is as simple and as hard as this. Drop what you believe about the dark or have been taught about the dark if you really want to see for yourself what's true. In other words, she's directing us to consider why we have preformed an understanding of what the dark is and why we think God stays only in the light. See, evolutionarily, we have default settings for darkness and light. We're afraid of the dark. Bad things happen in the dark. Darkness traps us, overwhelms us. Light sets us free. Dark is bad, light is good. Satan hides in the dark. God's only in the light. The darkness keeps him at bay. But what if this is wrong? What if the dark is as the light to God? And if so, perhaps darkness represents the things that we would rather not see or deal with. That God walks the darkness with ease. That light and darkness are both his. So this begs the questions. Can we learn to walk in the dark? What life-renewing, faith-recovering, hope-revealing discoveries might we make if we could learn to do that? The writer of the Gospel of Matthew recognized that his community was struggling in an unexpected darkness. See, more and more, their growing conviction that Jesus of Nazareth was really who he said he was, that he was the Son of God, the Messiah come after 400 years of pleading. But it fell on deaf ears within their community. Their friends, their families, and religious leaders refused to believe it. And as we heard last week from Pastor Alyssa, even the cheering crowds turned on Jesus when it became advantageous to do so. The light of welcoming their new king was fading quickly into the shadows of ancient politics and power struggles. And no one wanted to venture into that mess. It was dangerous. And it was deadly. So what do you do when you find yourself in the dark? Well, usually our fight or flight response automatically kicks in. And we either learn to walk in the darkness and fight it, or we run away. So hoping for the fight option, the writer of Matthew came up with a manual for the church. A guidebook for how the church must learn to live with itself and with others in the light and in the darkness we find. So he points out to them and to us that we have to improve our night vision, literally. We have to go against the human stream and head into the growing darkness that they and we see around us rather than avoiding it. And it seems to me, and this is painted with a broad stroke, but it seems to me there's 4 basic suggestions that I can find in Matthew for walking in the dark. Love God. He's as present in the darkness as in the light. Love your neighbor. Can we lessen the darkness they might be dealing with? Drop the sword, literally and figuratively. Violence and hatred squanders the energy we need for loving our neighbor. And there is an inevitable 4th step. Fail Jesus miserably. Weep bitterly. And then get up and try again. Barbara Brown Taylor found out that by exploring the darkness she found, that doesn't make us masters of the dark. But as we muster our courage and our determination to make a difference, we might just learn to walk in it and to get through it. What life-recovering discoveries can we make about ourselves and others if we're able to learn to face the darkness that we find? That is, the situations and places that we're not comfortable in. They frighten or anger or offend us. But as people of faith, we understand that we are supposed to get involved in these things anyway. And when we do, friends, that's walking in the dark. For instance, near the southwestern border of the United States, a group calling themselves the Samaritans gathered at a local church to fill gallon jugs with drinking water. And later they drive to a stretch of desert on the U.S. side of the Mexican border. And from there they hike into the barren, waterless terrain and leave the jugs of water in high traffic areas for those fleeing from the poverty and violence in the Central American countries. Now, we might be tempted to think that these Samaritans are all liberal social justice Christians or champions of radical immigration reform. But, and to my surprise, would be wrong. There are people on all sides of the argument. There are evangelical Christians, mainline and non-denominational Protestants and Roman Catholics. There are conservatives and progressives and agnostics and even atheists. Some are proponents of harsher punishments and penalties for any crossing of the U.S. border illegally. Others work to mitigate an immigration system that they feel needs revamped. There are so many political, theological, and personal differences in that group that it should keep the group divided and non-functional. It's difference like these that darken the paths and keep us separated and confused and keep us from moving forward through the darkness. But as Samaritans, they have one goal. They have a single mission. And they speak with one voice. We save lives. This focus is the light that unites them instead of tearing them apart. Friends, this is what it's like to walk in the dark. So they improved their spiritual night vision by following the example of Jesus and the disciples. So once again, they focused on loving God and all that that means. This means wrestling with the shadows in our own faith and our own will to decide if we can or if we will dare to follow where God is leading us instead of giving in to personal desires and preferences. They focused on loving their neighbor and all that that means. It means looking beyond our own wants and needs. It means reevaluating our households and our church economics so that the others are served at least as well, if not better, than we serve ourselves. And they focused on dropping the sword literally and figuratively by doing steps 1 and 2. And they understand that they failed Jesus miserably. And they wept bitterly. But they got over it and they showed up to try it again. Jesus put into action what God has required of us since he sent his Son to us. He loved, cared for, protected, stood with, spoke up for, went to bat for, and put himself at the risk for the last, the least, and the lost. And that's our neighbor, the foreigner, the sojourner, the disenfranchised, the underrepresented, the maligned, the marginalized, the unpopular and the disempowered peoples of all the world. His actions challenged the status quo. Jesus wasn't killed because he was a military threat to Rome. Surely. A rabbi and 12 guys? Come on. He was killed because he actually lived and acted like the Son of God that he was. He boldly walked in the dark, knowing that to God and to those of God, the dark's the same as the light. One more example of someone with night vision. I'm guessing some of us remember the presentation given to us a year or so back by Paul Jeffrey, the missionary we supported until he retired. He shared the events of the summer of 2015 that carried heartbreaking reports of boatload after boatload of families fleeing war and terror in Syria and Afghanistan. Hundreds died every day in overfilled vessels from dehydration and starvation and drowning. Amazingly, fleeing refugees were sometimes simply loaded into boats, put out to sea, and told to sail that way, and then get to Greece. And I remember listening to a national public radio broadcast at that time that included a conversation between NPR host Melissa Block and her husband's cousin, who was vacationing on a tiny Greek island when boats began to land. The cousin, Maria, explained that one of the first questions the refugees asked upon landing was, "Where are we?" They were quickly assured that this was part of Greece and that they were now safe and they were free and no one was going to hurt them. Those tourists were people just like you and I. They weren't missionaries or trained as first responders. They weren't trained nurses or doctors or were prepared for this situation. What they were prepared for was a fabulous vacation on a Greek beach. At first, Maria said we didn't know what to do. But then we walked along the shore and we saw families and babies and we saw that they needed help badly. And after a bit, we got ourselves organized and we went shopping. And we brought back water and food and disposable diapers. Lots of disposable diapers. And whatever clothes we could find or pilfer from our own kids. And we held the babies while the moms changed them. We helped set up a camp for them there on the beach. We didn't know what to do, so we just did something. Asked how many had landed so far on their little beach, the cousin said, well, there were about 50 in each boat, and there are 15 boats tied up so far. I don't know about your math, but my math says that's 750 people that they weren't prepared for, that they didn't know what to do with. But they did something. This is learning to walk in the dark. Learning to walk in the dark means we stop making excuses and being frozen in place because all we can see is what has been and what is now, but our vision falters when we consider what can be. Learning to walk in the dark means not waiting for the huge problem, the immense issue, the overwhelming complexities like violence and greed and poverty to be figured out, and that folks get comfortable with the solutions. Learning to walk in the dark means saving and comforting and interceding for the ones you find right in front of you, right now. On that vacation beach or in this community. This is probably uncharted territory for most of us. A territory populated by those with whom you disagree. That's more than likely true. A place and a time that conceals difficult challenges. Absolutely. The dark is the dark. But let us not forget that the dark is as day to God. Now, as I was backgrounding this text, I read a quote from Reverend Joseph Parker of London Temple, who was once asked by a skeptic, "How, sir, do you account for the fact that Jesus chose Judas to be a disciple?" I've been asked that a bunch. I don't know. But Dr. Parker answered like not Dr. Pat would answer. He said, "I have a greater problem than this. I don't know why Jesus chose Judas. But a bigger problem to me is, why did Jesus choose Joseph Parker?" See, that's the real point of this text. And by the way, it's the real point of Lent, isn't it? Judas' story of weakness and failure is our story, friends. So what are we going to do about it? Perhaps, like you, I see Judas in my own mirror too often when I'm walking through the dark and trying places of my faith. But I believe. I believe that Jesus is there, wherever there is, in darkness or light, offering grace. Yes, even amazing grace. Saying, the darkness is keeping you from seeing the light, but follow me. I'll lead you through the scary places. See, I think our text this morning isn't really just about some guy named Judas 2,000 years ago in the ancient Middle East. It's about us, you and me, learning to walk in dark places. How do we do that? By not letting the whys and why nots divide us. By understanding that the greatest darkness is our fear that God wants us to do his job. But he doesn't. And we can't. He just asks us to do ours. And when we do that, we find that he's adjusted our faith eyes to see the light that's bright enough to save even a wretch like Judas and me, with the grace that falls like rain. Amen. Will you please stand as you are able and join us in the hymn of response?